The crystalline basilica of Asterion IV looked less like a political chamber and more like someone had decided to host a diplomatic crisis inside a giant chandelier. Light refracted through towering quartz pillars, scattering rainbows across the polished floor where Princess Mirave stood alone in the supplication circle, hands clasped behind her back, long ears held at a dignified angle that suggested calm resignation rather than the quiet panic Julian suspected was happening internally. The nobles watched her from elevated terraces, robes shimmering with embedded starlight thread, and expressions ranging from polite boredom to the silent joy of people witnessing a disaster that did not involve them. It was the kind of silence that made Julian, standing among the temporary nobility section, wish he had brought snacks. His invitation to the Grand Assembly had been accidental, the result of a bureaucratic glitch that had stamped his salvage license with provisional noble status, which technically placed him just slightly above decorative furniture. He had planned to blend into the background, learn nothing, speak to no one, and possibly steal one of the complimentary crystal goblets for the Wayfarer's mismatched kitchen shelf. Instead, he found himself watching a princess be rejected with the same enthusiasm someone might use to decline expired cheese. Mirave's voice echoed through the chamber as she made her final appeal, offering alliance, shared legacy, and the restoration of her fallen house. House Selenar had once ruled 3 sectors before the Crimson Plague devoured their worlds and their reputation. Supporting her now meant inheriting debts, quarantine territory, and very bad political luck. The nobles declined with ceremonial apologies so elaborate they should have been accompanied by musical instruments. Julian told himself he wasn't reacting emotionally. He simply hated unfairness, humiliation, and anyone who spoke in long sentences without using contractions. But when Mirave's voice broke, not dramatically, just a tiny fracture that sounded like someone trying very hard not to fall apart, Julian's body moved before his brain issued any official instructions. One moment he was standing in the gallery, and the next he was striding across the basilica floor, boots tapping like someone who absolutely belonged there. Several nobles gasped as though witnessing a small mammal wander into an apex predator conference. Mirave turned, silver blonde hair shifting across her shoulders, her pale features composed except for her eyes, which held the stunned expression of someone thinking, politely and with great restraint, "What in the stars is this human doing?" Julian reached the supplication circle and dropped to one knee. Not a graceful motion, more like controlled falling, but it counted. The gesture carried ancient legal weight. Accepting her supplication meant binding himself to her burdens, debts, enemies, and any awkward family reunions still pending. The air froze. Even the atmospheric regulators seemed unsure whether to continue functioning. A noble from House Varelian sputtered something about tradition, contamination, and the general horror of humans touching things. Someone else demanded the assembly guards intervene, but the guards had already developed the survival instinct of pretending to be scenery. Mirave stared down at him, long ears tilted forward in disbelief. "Are you malfunctioning?" she whispered, voice so soft only he could hear. "Possibly," Julian replied. "It happens when I'm unsupervised." The High Adjudicator confirmed the oath as binding, voice trembling with the strained politeness of a man watching protocol set itself on fire. Confederation law was absolute. Once a supplication was accepted, no force, not politics, not pressure, not very offended nobles, could undo it. Murmurs rippled across the terraces, outrage layered with panic, as if centuries of tradition had been shattered by someone who still sometimes forgot to pay docking fees on time. When the assembly dissolved into chaos, Julian escorted Mirave toward the exit, while pretending he knew what escorts were supposed to do beyond not walking into walls. Mirave moved with rigid poise, though he noticed her left hand trembled slightly. "You do understand what you've done?" she asked. "Not entirely," he admitted, "but historically, my bad decisions lead to interesting outcomes. Also explosions." Her expression flickered, not quite amusement, not quite despair. Something caught between grief and disbelief that the universe had delivered her a Lord Protector who believed duct tape counted as engineering. Outside the basilica, diplomatic transports hummed away like startled insects, leaving the courtyard shimmering beneath Asterion's pale sky. Julian tried offering reassurance in the form of a confident nod, which unfortunately came out looking more like mild dizziness. Mirave regarded him with the careful contemplation one might give a malfunctioning artifact, uncertain whether to activate it or throw it into the nearest star. "You cannot simply kneel for a princess because she was being rejected," she said. "Actually," Julian replied, "I can. Turns out they don't check who's qualified before the kneeling part." For the first time, her composure cracked. not with tears but a tiny incredulous exhale that almost sounded like a laugh, quickly smothered beneath royal discipline. In that moment, surrounded by departing nobles and the echo of shattered expectations, Julian realized he had just become responsible for a princess, a fallen empire, and probably several assassination attempts. He also realized something else, something unexpected. He did not feel regret. He felt possibility, sharp and electric, like the first spark before an engine roars to life. And Miraeve, despite every reason to collapse, stood straighter than any of the nobles who had turned away. Her long ears lifted, not in arrogance, but resilience. She had lost everything, yet here she remained, steady as a fixed star. Julian had spent his life salvaging what others abandoned. For reasons he could not yet explain, he suspected that kneeling might have been the first time he chose something worth rebuilding. The Wayfarer was not the kind of ship anyone expected a newly sworn Lord Protector to own. It was shaped like someone had glued spare parts together out of spite, and then declared the result space-worthy. As Miraeve stepped onto the loading ramp, she paused, long ears lifting in a cautious arc, as though listening for structural integrity warnings. The hull let out a groan that sounded suspiciously like regret. "This is your vessel?" she asked. "Technically," Julian said, patting the wall, though she prefers the term dignified senior spacecraft. The wall immediately shed a small piece of paneling. Miraeve blinked. "It is molting." "Only seasonally," he assured her. Inside, the narrow corridor smelled faintly of engine coolant, and a substance Julian claimed was coffee, but might also qualify as a mild hazard. Miraeve observed everything with the polite horror of royalty encountering a new species. Her long ears angled backward when the lights flickered, then forward when the navigation console made a cheerful beeping noise that no one had authorized. Julian sealed the hatch just as the first volley of plasma fire splashed against the docking bay shields. Miraeve startled, stepping closer before she caught herself. "They are firing already. The assembly ended 12 minutes ago." "Efficiency is a virtue," Julian said, powering up the engines. "On the downside, so is holding a grudge." The Wayfarer lurched free of the bay with all the elegance of a drunken asteroid. Miraeve grabbed the nearest support rail, eyes widening. "Is your piloting always like this?" "Only during takeoff, landing, and anything in between," he replied. A holographic alert flashed across the console, displaying 3 small interceptor signatures gaining speed. Miraeve stiffened, the remnants of royal training settling over her like armor. "Those are House Varelian craft." "Ah, yes," Julian said. "The ones who called me biological contamination with boots. Lovely people." He executed a maneuver that theoretically counted as evasive, but was also legally adjacent to falling. The ship dipped through the upper atmosphere, clouds streaking past like silver smoke. Miraeve braced herself, breathing slow and steady, determined not to look panicked. Her long ears betrayed her, twitching every time the stabilizers whimpered. "Are you certain this ship can withstand pursuit?" she asked. "Absolutely," Julian said. "Well, statistically." "Statistically?" 40% success rate. Miraeve closed her eyes. "That number is not comforting." "Then it's working," he said. "I find low expectations very soothing." The Wayfarer finally slipped into open space, engines roaring as the jump drive warmed. The interceptors fired again, plasma streaks glowing against the shields. Miraeve steadied herself at the co-pilot station, fingers flying across unfamiliar controls with the precision of someone raised among starborn aristocrats. "You can fly?" Julian asked, impressed. "I was educated," she said. "We were expected to understand governance, diplomacy, and at least one method of emergency escape." "Well," he said, "you're already overqualified compared to most of my crew." "You have no crew." "True," Julian admitted. "But if I did, imagine their potential." The jump drive hummed, light stabilizing for the first time since startup. Miraeve glanced at him. "If we survive, House Selenar may owe you a debt that cannot be repaid." "Good," Julian said. "I like being owed things. Makes me sound important." For the briefest moment, she almost smiled. The Wayfarer leapt into hyperspace with a sound like reality clearing its throat. Colors rippled across the viewport, swirling in iridescent bands. Miraeve's posture softened, the tension unspooling from her shoulders. Julian studied her in the reflected light, pale skin, silver blonde hair falling like starlight, long ears lifting slowly, no longer in shock, but something quieter. Resolve. "You truly had no plan," she said. "Incorrect," Julian replied. "I had a plan. It just hadn't introduced itself yet." Miraeve folded her hands. You have entangled yourself in a fallen house, inherited 3 quarantine systems, and provoked half the Confederation. Technically, Julian corrected, they provoked themselves. I just provided the opportunity. Silence settled over the cockpit, not heavy, but uncertain. Miraev's voice lowered. Why did you kneel? Julian hesitated, staring at the stars streaming past. Because everyone else was walking away. She absorbed this without responding, as though turning the words over like fragile glass. The ship drifted through the calm stretch of hyperspace, the hum of the engines steady and almost comforting. After a long moment, Miraeve exhaled. I do not know what comes next, she said. Relax, Julian answered. That makes 2 of us. Statistically, this means we are a team. Miraeve closed her eyes, not in despair, but in the exhausted acknowledgement that the universe had unexpectedly delivered her a human who refused to abandon a sinking ship, even if the ship occasionally tried to blow itself up. Somewhere beyond the jump corridor, 3 dead worlds waited, silent, quarantined, forgotten. Somewhere within them, ancient technology slept beneath ash and ruin. Julian adjusted the navigation path, feeling the familiar spark of reckless optimism flare beneath his ribs. Beside him, Miraeve sat straighter, long ears lifting, not in fear but readiness. For the first time since kneeling, Julian realized something extraordinary. They were not running. They were heading towards something. Hyperspace exited with all the grace of someone stepping off a moving walkway without warning. The wayfarer shuddered, lights flickering in what Julian swore was a dramatic fashion rather than an electrical malfunction. Miraeve gripped the armrest, long ears tilted forward as the swirling corridor dissolved into a scattering of stars and one very unfriendly-looking planet. The world below was gray and silent, its surface veiled in shifting clouds of ash. Orbital beacons blinked warnings in every known language, plus one that simply displayed an unhappy face. Miraeve stared through the viewport, expression unreadable. Selenar Prime, she said quietly. My family's cradle. Julian cleared his throat. Looks cozy. Her gaze sharpened. It is quarantined, haunted by plague, and surrounded by automated defense satellites. So, he said, a fixer-upper. The ship's sensors crackled, struggling to process the atmospheric interference. Miraeve leaned closer to the console, fingers gliding across controls with practiced precision. Her long ears twitched as the scan returned faint readings. Subsurface structures, she murmured, but not ours. The architecture is older. Julian grinned. Precursor older? Her eyes flicked toward him. Possibly. Or it could be geological noise. Or very angry rodents. Let's hope for ancient alien technology, he said. Rodents usually charge rent. As they descended into low orbit, the silence of the dead world pressed around them. Miraeve straightened, posture regal despite the cramped cockpit. I was 9 the last time I stood beneath this sky, she said. My father told me our house would stand for 1,000 generations. Julian softened his voice. Technically, it still stands. Just less upright. To his surprise, the corner of her mouth lifted. Only slightly, but enough. The wayfarer passed over the remains of what had once been a capital city. Towers lay collapsed like broken ribs, streets buried beneath dust. Yet beneath the devastation, faint geometric patterns pulsed on Julian's display. Circles, grids, and something that looked suspiciously like a door. Miraeve inhaled sharply. Those are not plague signatures. Julian tapped the console. Congratulations. Your planet is haunted by aliens instead of disease, which in my professional opinion is an upgrade. She turned toward him, long ears angled in disbelief. You joke at a time like this? Yes, Julian said. Otherwise, I might start screaming. A proximity alarm blared unexpectedly, causing both of them to jump. The source appeared on the screen, a small object drifting toward them from the planet's surface. Miraeve's eyes widened. Is that a shuttle? The vessel was ancient, covered in dust and scorch marks, its engines barely burning. Julian opened a channel. Static answered. Then a voice, cracked, distorted, barely a whisper. Selenar! Respond! Miraeve froze, color draining from her face. That frequency belongs to our royal emergency line. It should not exist anymore. The shuttle drifted closer, spinning lightly. Julian adjusted thrusters, guiding it into the docking bay with the kind of concentration normally reserved for diffusing explosives or assembling furniture without instructions. When the airlock finally sealed, Miraeve stood motionless, long ears lifted in stunned anticipation. Julian gave her a reassuring nod. If it's a ghost, we run. If it's a person, we also run, but politely. She did not smile this time. The inner door slid open with a hiss, revealing a figure slumped in the shuttle's cockpit. An older man in tattered royal crests, breathing shallowly but alive. Miraiv staggered forward, shock breaking through years of practice control. "Captain Arvin," she whispered. "He was my father's guard commander." Julian checked the man's pulse. "He's dehydrated, exhausted, and definitely overdue for retirement." Arvin's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty. When he saw Miraiv, he tried to rise. "Your Highness, you returned." Miraiv knelt beside him, voice trembling. "Why are you here? How did you survive?" Arvin swallowed. "The plague did not take everyone. Some of us hid in the vaults. We waited for rescue that never came." Julian blinked. "How long have you been down there?" 13 years, Arvin whispered. Miraiv's breath caught. Julian exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, trying gently, "on the bright side, at least we know the quarantine system works." Miraiv shot him a look sharp enough to cut titanium. "Too soon," Julian admitted. Arvin grasped Miraiv's hand, voice urgent despite his frailty. "The vaults are not what we believed. The plague was not only disease. Something else sleeps beneath the surface. Your family tried to contain it." Miraiv's long ears lowered in shock. "What do you mean?" Arvin's eyes slid closed. "Do not open the vaults." Julian and Miraiv exchanged a silent glance, the kind that carried every possible meaning except comfort. Then the navigation console chimed, multiple ships emerging from hyperspace. House Varelian. Miraiv stood, shoulders squared, grief hardening into resolve. "They followed us." Julian powered the shields. "Fantastic. I was worried today would be uneventful." The first volley lit up the stars. The Wayfarer trembled, and for the second time since kneeling, Julian realized he was no longer protecting a fallen princess. He was standing beside someone who had just learned her world was not dead, only waiting. The palace station emerged from the Veil Nebula like a forgotten crown, massive, silent, and coated in drifting stardust that sparkled in the pale light of the dying sun nearby. The Wayfarer approached with all the confidence of a house cat attempting diplomacy with a grand piano. Miraiv stood at the viewport, long ears lifted in breathless stillness, staring at the structure that had once been her home. Its spires rose like frozen lightning, but entire sections were dark, lifeless, and stripped of power. The docking rings flickered weakly, as if trying to remember how hospitality worked. Julian cleared his throat. "So, should I knock?" Miraiv didn't respond at first. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant. "This station was the heart of House Selenar. Weddings were held in the upper gardens. Treaties were signed in the Hall of Radiance. My sister and I once hid in the ventilation shafts to avoid etiquette lessons." Julian nodded solemnly. "A noble tradition. I did something similar, except it involved hiding from debt collectors." The docking clamps engaged with a metallic groan that suggested they were deeply disappointed to be awake again. As the airlock cycled open, a cold draft swept through the corridor, carrying the faint scent of metal and dust, overlaid with something else, something ancient, like air that had waited too long to be breathed. Miraiv stepped inside first, posture rigid. Her boots echoed down the empty hall. Julian followed, holding a portable scanner that beeped encouragingly every time it detected particles that might kill them. "According to this," Julian said, "the atmosphere is breathable." Miraiv exhaled. "That is reassuring." "With mild hallucinogenic potential." She paused. Reassuring was a premature conclusion. The lights activated in slow segments, illuminating the vast entrance chamber. Translucent banners bearing the Selenar crest hung in tatters from the vaulted ceiling. Dust floated in the stillness, disturbed for the first time in over a decade. Miraiv reached out and brushed the nearest railing, her fingers trembling before she hid her hand behind her back again. "I never thought I would return like this," she murmured. Julian softened his voice. "For what it's worth, we arrived dramatically. That has to count for something." Their footsteps carried them into the throne room, a circular space lined with crystal pillars, now dim and cracked. The throne itself sat at the center, its surface dulled, the once luminous crest dark. Miraiv stared at it with a stillness Julian wasn't sure how to break. He cleared his throat. "Well, this is perfect. We just need to turn it into a functioning base, restore power, revive civilization, and avoid mysterious subterranean doom." Easy checklist. Miraiv blinked slowly, long ears angling toward him. "You believe this is possible?" "Absolutely," Julian said. "I specialize in impossible. Also in poor life choices. This overlaps nicely. She didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted, a flicker of warmth beneath the grief. Julian activated the portable generator, and the room hummed weakly to life. Consoles lit in irregular patterns, some sputtering, others sparking in ways that implied they were unhappy about being resurrected. Mirave moved to the central interface, her fingers gliding across controls that flickered beneath her touch. Main systems are offline, she reported, but the lower vaults still hold auxiliary power. I can reroute it. Julian hesitated. When you say vaults, you don't mean the vaults Captain Arvin warned us about, do you? Mirave froze for a heartbeat. Then carefully. No. Those lie beneath the surface of Selenar Prime. This station's vaults are merely storage. Julian relaxed. Good. Because mysterious, forbidden vaults tend to ruin my week. The console suddenly emitted a sharp burst of static. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers, fragmented, mechanical, and vaguely irritated. Unauthorized. Presence. Identify. Julian jumped. Your building is talking. Does it do that often? Mirave straightened, slipping into the tone of someone born to command. This is Princess Mirave of House Selenar, rightful heir to this station. Recognize my authority. There was a long pause, then the voice responded. Identity. Verified. Note. Heir is significantly shorter than recorded. Julian coughed, attempting not to laugh. Mirave closed her eyes in dignified suffering. Activate internal systems, she ordered. Processing, the station replied. Warning, 93% of systems are non-functional. Recommendation, abandonment. Julian patted the nearest console. Too late, we already moved in. As the light strengthened, faint tremors rumbled beneath the floor, machinery waking after years of silence. Mirave looked around, her long ears slowly rising, not in fear but in something fragile and rebuilding. Hope. Julian climbed onto the balcony overlooking the silent fleet beyond the glass. Rows of derelict ships suspended in the nebula like ghosts waiting for orders. Mirave joined him, her voice barely above a whisper. They were meant to protect the Confederation. Now they drift like tombs. Julian leaned on the railing. Then let's change that. She turned to him, eyes reflecting the nebula's violet glow. You do not regret kneeling? Not even a little, he said. Besides, regret requires planning ahead. A long silence settled, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something waking. The shipyard stretched beneath the station like a sleeping continent, vast rings of scaffolding and half-built vessels suspended in the nebula's violet haze. Julian stared through the observation window, trying to decide whether he felt awe or the sudden urge to lie down and pretend someone else was responsible for all this. Mirayev stood beside him, long ears angled forward in focused concentration, tracking data on the flickering console. These shipyards were once the pride of the Confederation, she said softly. My father claimed they could assemble a cruiser in 9 days. Julian nodded. Impressive. I once assembled a coffee machine in 9 hours. It exploded, but still, achievement. Mirayev exhaled through her nose, the royal equivalent of a laugh. The station's diagnostic reports scrolled upward, revealing energy signatures deep within the structure, sealed access points, inactive machinery, and, more concerning, a cluster of heat readings where nothing should be alive. Julian tapped the display. These vaults, are we absolutely certain they only contain storage? Mirayev hesitated for the length of a heartbeat. They are not the same as the vaults below Selenar Prime. These were used for prototype development. Prototype what? She folded her hands. Experimental starship components. Advanced shielding. It is also possible my uncle stored an extremely large wine collection. Julian brightened. Finally, useful technology. With power partially restored, the main access platform extended toward the nearest derelict vessel, an angular cruiser suspended like a monument frozen in mid-construction. The Wayfarer's shuttle disengaged from the docking cradle, drifting toward the silent giant. Mirave handled the controls with calm precision, while Julian tried not to think about the fact that the cruiser was held in place by magnetic clamps older than his entire ship. Inside, the corridors were dark and dust-coated, faintly echoing with their footsteps. The emergency lights flickered awake as Mirayev accessed the control panel, her long ears twitching at every spark. Power cells are intact, she murmured. Strange. They should have depleted years ago. Julian raised his scanner. I'm getting precursor signatures. Mirayev turned sharply. That is impossible. No human or Selenar technology should be reading as... The floor vibrated beneath them. Then a deep metallic thrum rolled through the ship, like the sound of something enormous remembering how to breathe. Julian stepped back. Okay, so either the ship is waking up, or we just activated a very large dishwasher. Marie's fingers flew over the controls, attempting to shut the process down. The systems are overriding me. This technology is not ours. The lights surged, flooding the corridor with cold silver illumination. Holographic schematics burst into the air, complex starship designs that made Julian's brain attempt escape through the back of his skull. Marave stared, stunned. This is precursor engineering, integrated into cellular construction. Julian tried to look knowledgeable. Yes, obviously, I was just thinking that. A calm synthetic voice echoed through the ship. Activation sequence acknowledged. Awaiting command authorization. Miraevi swallowed. It recognizes Selenar lineage. Julian grinned despite himself. Congratulations. Your family built alien hybrid superships. Very casual. She ignored him, lifting her chin. This is Princess Miraeve of House Selenar. Cease activation until systems can be stabilized. The ship processed her request. Request denied. Stabilization required to prevent catastrophic failure. Julian blinked. Catastrophic failure sounds bad. Purely from a linguistic standpoint. Miraeve turned to him, composure cracking. If the core ignites, the entire shipyard could detonate. Julian reacted the way any trained professional would. He began pressing buttons. Miraeve's eyes widened. Do not. The ship hummed loudly, then lowered into a soft, idle rumble. Touch anything, she finished weakly. Julian stared at his hand. I fixed it. You guessed. Educated guessing, he corrected. Fine. Semi-educated. Miraeve pressed her palm against the nearest console, slowly catching her breath. Now that the crisis had passed, the scaled-down glow of the activation field washed across her face, softening the tension that had held her since arrival. This changes everything, she whispered. If we can reactivate even one of these vessels, House Selenar is not merely surviving, it is returning. Julian leaned against the console. Good, because if we're going to make enemies, we might as well be impressive about it. Her long ears lifted, not in alarm, but hope. They made their way back toward the airlock, the cruiser humming quietly behind them, like a giant stretching after a long sleep. Julian glanced at Miraeve, noticing the subtle shift in her stride. Less burdened, more grounded, as if the ship's awakening had lit something inside her. You look different, he said. She blinked. Different how? Like someone who stopped standing in the ruins and started building again. For a moment, Miraeve didn't answer. Then quietly, I did not expect a human to be the first person who believed I still had a future. Julian tried to respond, but the words tangled somewhere between sincerity and panic. Fortunately, the station chose that moment to issue an alert. Unauthorized vessels entering the sector. Miraeve straightened, resolve settling over her like armor. They are coming to divide what remains. Julian checked the power readings. Then they'd better hurry. She turned to him, calm and unshaken. Because for the first time, Miraeve said, something remains worth defending. The broadcast chamber had not been used in 13 years, which meant it greeted their arrival with the enthusiasm of a door awakened from a long nap. Screens flickered, projectors hummed, and the main console emitted a low groan that Julian interpreted as either boot-up sequence or profound existential regret. Miraeve stood at the center of the circular platform, long ears lifted in poised determination, staring at the activation panel as though preparing for battle rather than public communication. You are certain this will function? She asked. Julian patted the nearest console, which immediately sparked in protest. Absolutely, in the sense that it might. Miraeve inhaled slowly, the noble version of bracing for disaster. The chamber lights brightened, illuminating her pale features and silver blonde hair. For a moment, Julian saw not the abandoned princess who had knelt alone in a silent assembly, but someone stepping into the place she'd been born to stand. Whether the galaxy liked it or not, the station system announced, broadcast link established. Warning, visual filters outdated. Air may appear shorter than ideal. Julian muttered, the building has opinions again. Miraeve ignored both of them. The transmission field unfolded like a shimmering veil, reaching across the star systems, slipping through quarantine barriers, carrying her image to worlds that had once spoken her family's name with pride. Julian watched her shoulders rise and settle as she began to speak. This is Princess Miraeve of House Selenar, she said, voice steady, clear, and unflinching. My family is gone. My worlds are broken, but I have returned, not to reclaim what was lost, but to rebuild what remains. Somewhere across the galaxy, forgotten colonists paused. Freight crews stopped mid-loading. Even the station seemed to hold its breath. Marave continued, "Those who abandoned us may continue to turn away. But those who were left behind, we have not forgotten you." House Selenar does not end in silence. Julian felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he immediately tried to diagnose as mild indigestion. The message concluded and the broadcast faded. Silence settled gently over the chamber. Then the responses began. At first, a single incoming signal, then 3, then dozens. Worlds that had been ignored for years. Outposts, mining colonies, agricultural moons, sending short, halting transmissions. Some offered allegiance. Others simply said they were still alive. Mirave stood motionless, staring at the growing list of signals, her long ears trembling just slightly. Julian stepped beside her. "People heard you." She blinked rapidly. "I did not expect any response at all." "Really?" Julian said. "I was expecting at least one complaint about signal quality." Before she could respond, the station issued a new alert. "High priority transmission, origin, House Varelian flagship." Julian sighed. Of course, they never miss an opportunity to ruin a good moment. The hologram activated, revealing Lord Varelian, regal, furious, and wearing a cape so dramatic it could probably be seen from orbit. His expression suggested he had swallowed several lemons and was now deeply offended by their acidity. "Princess Miraiv," he declared, "you are in violation of Confederation protocol. You have no authority to reactivate those shipyards, and you will surrender them immediately." Miraiv lifted her chin. "House Selenar still holds legal claim. Your house is extinct." Julian stepped into view. "Hello. Not extinct. Very busy." Lord Varelian's eyelid twitched. "The human has opinions." "Frequently," Julian confirmed. "Would you like more?" Miraiv placed a hand gently on his arm, a polite way of saying, "Please stop before we start a war with sarcasm alone." She faced the hologram. "You cannot divide what was never yours." "Then you leave us no choice," Varelian said. "We are coming." The transmission cut. Julian exhaled. "Well, that was friendly." Miraiv turned toward the observation window, watching the silent fleet beyond the glass. "They will attempt to seize the shipyards before we can complete activation." Julian leaned against the console. "Then we activate faster." She hesitated. "You speak as though this is simple." "It is absolutely not simple," he said. "But complicated things are just simple things wearing fancy costumes." Miraiv's long ears lifted despite herself. They spent the next hours coordinating power distribution, stabilizing core systems, and rerouting energy from forgotten infrastructure. The palace station thrummed with new life, machinery waking like old bones remembering motion. Miraive worked with the quiet intensity of someone stitching a torn empire back together, while Julian improvised solutions that defied logic, regulations, and occasionally physics. When they finally paused, the nebula cast violet light across the chamber. Miraive leaned against the railing, exhaustion softened by something almost peaceful. Julian joined her. "You realize this is the part where you doubt everything, and I give an inspirational speech." She angled her head. "Are you capable of inspirational speeches?" "They happen accidentally," Julian said. "Usually when I'm trying to order lunch." A long, soft silence followed. Miraive spoke quietly. "When I stood in the basilica, no one answered me. I believed that meant I was alone." "You're not," Julian said without hesitation. Her long ears lowered, not in sadness, but something gentler. "Thank you," she murmured. Julian looked away quickly, pretending to examine the nebula. "Well, don't start getting emotional. I have a reputation as a disaster to maintain." Before she could respond, alarms echoed through the station, multiple ships entering the sector. Miraive straightened, resolve solidifying like forged metal. Julian powered the defenses, heart steady. For the first time, they were not reacting. They were ready. The first enemy ships emerged from the nebula, like sharks gliding out of a violet sea, sleek, polished, and very confident about their chances. Julian stood at the command console, hands hovering over controls he absolutely should not have been allowed to touch. Miraive stood beside him, long ears steady, gaze fixed on the approaching fleet. She no longer looked like someone waiting for permission to exist. She looked like someone prepared to make the galaxy regret underestimating her. "House Varelian is deploying boarding craft," the station announced cheerfully, as if offering dessert options. Julian nodded. "Excellent. I was just thinking we needed more chaos." Miraive gave him a sideways glance. "Your coping mechanisms are concerning." Thank you, he said. The first volley struck the station's shields, sending a tremor through the floor. The crystal pillars vibrated, scattering refracted light across the throne room, as if the architecture were trying to contribute dramatic lighting. Julian activated the defense grid they had patched together from precursor systems and pure hope. The response was immediate. Energy surged through dormant channels, and a shimmering barrier expanded outward, like a protective starburst. Miraev's breath caught. It works, Julian grinned. Of course it works. I pressed the correct button on purpose. You guessed. Confidently, he corrected. The defense array fired. A pulse of brilliant light rippled through space, disabling the lead vessels without destroying them, a small mercy Miraev insisted upon. The remaining ships scattered, scrambling to regroup. Lord Varelian's furious transmission burst onto the screen, his cape now aggressively offended. This is treason, he snarled. Julian shrugged. To be fair, we've had a very flexible week. Miraev stepped forward, voice calm and unshakable. House Selenar stands again. Leave this sector, or I will consider your presence an act of war. Varelian sputtered. You have one shipyard and a human with a death wish. Julian raised a hand. Two things. First, I do not have a death wish. I have a survival style that confuses observers. Second, we actually have 3 shipyards online now. Surprise. Miraev placed a hand on Julian's arm, not to stop him, just grounding him, as if they were no longer 2 separate people reacting to the world, but one force facing it together. Varelian's expression shifted, not fear, but realization. The galaxy had changed without asking his permission. He cut the transmission and withdrew, the fleet retreating into the nebula without another shot. The silence that followed was not tense. It was victorious. For a long moment, no one spoke. The station lights brightened fully for the first time since their arrival, illuminating the throne room in steady, living radiance. Miraev stood at the center, shoulders lowering as if releasing a weight she had carried since childhood. It is done, she murmured. Julian exhaled, only now realizing how tightly his chest had been wound. So, what happens next? Do we have a coronation? A parade? Matching uniforms? Because I look terrible in capes, but I'm willing to try. Miraev turned to him, and for the first time since the Basilica, she smiled. Not faintly, not cautiously, but warmly enough to feel like a sunrise. No cape, she said, but perhaps a beginning. They walked the length of the balcony overlooking the reborn shipyards. Crews from the responding colonies had already begun arriving, their transmissions filled with cautious hope and terrible construction music. The derelict fleet shimmered as restoration drones activated, systems humming back to life, one vessel at a time. Julian leaned on the railing. You know, when I woke up this week, my goals were small. Don't crash the ship. Avoid paperwork. Definitely do not adopt a princess. Miraev's long ears lifted. And yet here you are. Here I am, he echoed. She studied him for a moment, expression softening. You changed everything. Julian shook his head. No, you just needed someone to kneel first. You've been standing on your own this whole time. Silence settled, not empty, but full, like a room finally breathing again. Miraev looked out at the nebula. My house is no longer fallen, but it is also no longer what it was. That's good, Julian said. Old versions collapse, new ones grow. She let the words sink in, then turned back to him. Will you remain? Julian blinked. Is that a formal request or a polite suggestion? It is, she said carefully. An invitation. He considered pretending to think about it, but the answer had been decided the moment he knelt in the supplication circle. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Her long ears lifted with quiet relief. They stood together beneath the restored lights. No longer a discarded princess and a mismatched pilot, but something unexpected, something chosen. Far below, the shipyards awakened fully, engines rumbling like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. Julian smiled at Miraev. So, what now? She looked ahead, eyes steady. Now, she said, we build.